Marcus was already talking when I sat down, like the conversation had started without me and my presence was just a formality. He leaned back in the chair across the small conference table, one ankle resting over his knee, phone face down beside his hand. He smiled the way he always did when he thought he was being generous. "You should have seen the place," he said. "Monaco looks fake in real life. Like a movie set." Lena cried when we walked into the suite. I nodded once. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the air system. He took that nod as encouragement. 3 nights on the yacht, he went on, casual. Private chef. Helicopter transfer. Honestly, if you're going to do a honeymoon, that's how you do it. He laughed softly, then added, "I mean, what's the point of having money just sitting there?" He said it like a joke, but his eyes stayed on my face, watching to see if it landed. I noticed the way his fingers kept tapping the table, not nervous exactly, more impatient. He wanted agreement. Or absolution. Maybe both. I asked, "Which account did you use?" He waved a hand. "The family one. The trust. Same thing." He smiled again, wider this time. "Relax. It's not like I drained it. 3.5. Barely a dent." Barely a dent. I repeated the phrase silently, not correcting him. The light above us flickered once, then steadied. I noticed that too. I always notice small things. Marcus never did. "You didn't ask," I said. My voice sounded even to my own ears. He shrugged. "Didn't need to. You're settled, EV. House paid off. No kids." This was my moment. He leaned forward now. "And technically, it's all family money. Mom said you'd understand." He said our mother's words carefully, like he was setting something fragile on the table between us. I didn't touch it. I thought about the way trust documents are written, how words like discretionary and beneficiary get used to soften hard lines. I thought about timing, about signatures, about how banks flag movement, even when they don't stop it. Marcus mistook my silence for acceptance. "I knew you'd be cool about it," he said. "You always are." I smiled, small and polite, the kind that doesn't promise anything. "I'm glad you enjoyed yourself," I said. His shoulders relaxed. He reached for his phone. The conversation, to him, was already over. As we stood to leave, I noticed the envelope tucked halfway out of his bag, thick paper, trustee letterhead. He followed my gaze and slid it back in without comment. Something had already shifted. He just didn't feel it yet. I didn't call the bank right away. I made coffee first. The slow kind, grounds measured by habit, water brought just short of boiling. I let the kitchen fill with that familiar smell because routine keeps my hands steady. When I finally sat at the desk, the morning light was already angled across the papers I hadn't touched since before Marcus left for Europe. The confirmation came without drama. Numbers rarely announce themselves. The balance was simply different. Smaller. Precise in a way that felt almost impersonal. 3.5 million, moved in 2 transfers, routed cleanly, authorized cleanly. The screen didn't accuse anyone. It just reflected what had already happened. I stared at it longer than I needed to. Not in disbelief. In recognition. Later that afternoon, Lena stopped by. She said she was in the neighborhood, said it lightly, as if proximity explained intention. She stood in my doorway with her sunglasses still on, lips already set in a practiced smile. Monaco had left a mark on her. Not tan. Assurance. "I brought pastries," she said, lifting the box. "Marcus said you like the almond ones." I did. I took the box and set it on the counter without opening it. She walked in, slow, careful not to brush against anything. Her eyes moved around the room, taking inventory. Framed photos. Neutral furniture. The absence of clutter. She was looking for signs. Of anger. Maybe. Or damage. We sat across from each other, the small kitchen table between us. I poured tea. She declined sugar. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced, nails immaculate. She didn't mention the honeymoon. She didn't mention the money. "You must be tired," she said finally. "All that responsibility." The word landed where she intended. I met her gaze. She held it, but there was a flicker there, quick and gone. I realized then that she knew exactly how much had been taken. Not approximately. Exactly. "I manage fine," I said. She nodded, too quickly. Marcus said everything was handled. Handled. Another soft word. I watched her breathe in through her nose, slow, controlled. She was waiting for me to push. To say something that could be repeated later, edited, used. I didn't. We drank our tea. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to count. She glanced at it twice. When she stood to leave, she hesitated near the door, one hand on the frame. You know how he is, she said, almost apologetic. Almost. I do, I replied. She smiled again, relief flashing before she could stop it. When the door closed behind her, the house felt quieter than before. I cleared the cups, opened the pastry box, and wrapped it shut again without taking one. There would be a time to speak. This wasn't it. Silence, I'd learned, travels farther than words when you let it. Richard Coleman's office had the kind of quiet that came from money being handled carefully. Not loudly earned, not aggressively spent. Just managed. The carpet muted sound. The chairs were firm without being uncomfortable. Everything suggested that nothing rushed ever happened here. He didn't ask me why I was there. He already knew. The file was open in front of him, neatly tabbed, my name typed once on the spine and nowhere else. That alone told me something. This wasn't new to him. It was only new to me. You oversee the trust, he said, not as a question. But you're not the only one with access. I nodded. He slid a single page toward me. Not the full statement. Just the movement summary. Dates. Amounts. Authorization codes. Clean. Almost elegant. Trust funds are built for continuity, he continued. They're designed to function even when families don't. That line stayed with me. He explained it the way someone explains gravity. No emphasis. No warning. The trust had provisions written years ago, back when my parents believed shared access meant shared values. Certain withdrawals didn't require immediate secondary approval if they fit predefined categories. Education. Health. Family-related life events. Honeymoons. I asked. Richard didn't smile. Travel associated with marital consolidation can qualify, he said carefully, depending on how it's framed. Framed. Another word that carried weight. He pointed to a section I hadn't noticed before. A paragraph dense enough to be skipped by anyone reading emotionally instead of procedurally. This clause, he said, tapping it once, is where timing matters. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. His voice stayed even, but his finger lingered half a second longer than necessary. I understood the signal. There was something here. Something narrow. Something most people missed because they were busy arguing elsewhere. What happens now? I asked. That depends on what you do next, he replied. And when? I looked at the paper again. At the neatness of it. The absence of drama. Marcus hadn't stolen anything in the way people imagine theft. He had stepped into a space that had been left open and assumed it was meant for him. I folded the page once and placed it back on the desk. Richard waited. If I do nothing, I asked quietly, how long before this becomes irreversible? Samuel Price did not stand when I entered. He didn't need to. The room already worked in his favor. Trusteeship offices don't look like law firms. There's less theater. Fewer diplomas on the wall. The power doesn't come from persuasion. It comes from procedure. From forms that don't care how anyone feels. Samuel sat behind a desk that had been used by other men before him. The wood was worn smooth where forearms had rested, signatures had been made permanent, decisions recorded without commentary. He greeted me politely, not warmly. That distinction mattered. You're listed as co-beneficiary, he said, checking a screen, and secondary administrator. I corrected him gently. Primary, I said. On paper. He nodded, as if that explained everything. He did not ask about Monaco. He did not ask about Marcus. Trustees rarely ask questions that don't have boxes to fit into. Instead, he slid a folder toward me. Thicker than the one Richard had shown me. Heavier. This was the version meant to survive scrutiny. Withdrawals were authorized, he said. Improperly, perhaps. But not illegally. Not yet. The phrase landed cleanly. He walked me through the mechanics without emphasis. How access tiers worked. How certain family-related expenditures bypassed immediate review. How delays were built in intentionally, not as a flaw but as insulation. The trust assumed people acted in good faith. It was designed that way on purpose. Time is the stabilizer, Samuel said. Immediate reactions create instability. I noticed how often he used neutral language. No blame. No defense. Just process. What happens if I contest? I asked. That depends on when, he replied. And how? There it was again. Timing. Always timing. He turned one page. Just one. I caught the movement. It wasn't for me. It was for him. A signal to himself that he was entering a different procedural lane. There are options available that don't look like options, he said. Most people don't notice them because they're quiet. I didn't ask him to explain. I didn't need to. Something had already begun to assemble in my mind. Not a plan. Not yet. More like negative space. The outline of something formed by what wasn't being said. He closed the folder. For now, he continued, there will be a review period. Standard. During that time, no further disbursements of this size will clear without additional verification. How long? I asked. Samuel checked the calendar, not theatrically, just accurately. Long enough, he said. I thanked him. He accepted it without acknowledgement. As I left, I realized something subtle but important had shifted. Marcus still believed he was ahead. But somewhere inside this building, a clock had started ticking in a direction he wasn't watching. Marcus didn't need to knock. I was already at the kitchen table, the remnants of breakfast cooling between us. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, the kind of casual dominance that feels rehearsed. You saw the numbers, right? He asked, voice even, almost conversational. $3.5 million. All there, all mine, for the honeymoon. Monaco isn't going to pay for itself. I stirred my coffee slowly, keeping my eyes on the rim of the cup. Yes, I said quietly. You were thorough. He laughed, a short, self-satisfied sound. Thorough? That's generous. I call it efficiency. You understand, I hope. There's no way I could have done it without, well, the trust being as flexible as it is. You know, family rules. I nodded. Of course, I murmured. My words were light, almost teasing, but careful. The tone mattered. I wanted him to believe I was just being polite, compliant. He moved closer, as if proximity would remind me of the stakes. You're lucky I'm reasonable. Some siblings would have caused a scene. I like to think you get it. I handle things. You watch. We both win. His eyes flicked toward the open laptop on the table. I had glanced at statements earlier, noticing subtle irregularities, confirmations of access, the timing of transfers. Small, but precise. My hands rested calmly on the table. Outwardly, nothing betrayed that I was noting every detail. You always do have a good memory, I said softly. And I like numbers, as you know. You did it cleanly. He smirked, nodding, accepting the compliment as an affirmation of his control. Exactly, he said. Clean. Transparent. Legal. He emphasized the last word, as if to remind me he knew the loopholes better than anyone. And we're family. No one will question that. I kept my lips pressed lightly together, careful not to shift in a way that might reveal a reaction. Silence can be more unsettling than speech. He didn't know I had already started thinking through every procedural safeguard, every clause Samuel had mentioned. He assumed I was absorbed in anxiety, trapped by his casual presentation of authority. Do you ever wonder, I said slowly, letting the words float without urgency, how long something like this can stay unnoticed? Marcus blinked once, momentarily uncertain, then recovered with a dismissive chuckle. Why would I? Everything's accounted for. You're here, I'm here. We understand the boundaries. There's no drama. He paused, leaning on the counter, and I noticed how he relaxed. His confidence wasn't arrogance yet, it was the smug certainty of someone who believes the game is already won. You'll see, he said quietly, but to himself more than to me. You'll see how smooth this all runs. I nodded again, saying nothing further. Inside, I felt the smallest ripple of anticipation. The subtle cracks of his overconfidence were not visible to him. He believed silence equaled submission. He believed the stage was set entirely in his favor. But as I watched him turn toward the living room, adjusting his posture, I realized how tightly he had tied his own hands with certainty. And I, in contrast, was already counting the moments he couldn't anticipate. I closed the kitchen door behind me and sank into the chair by the small desk in the corner. The sunlight slanting through the blinds hit the stack of papers I had pulled from the safe earlier. Every sheet, every ledger entry, every stamped signature felt heavier than its weight in ink and paper. I spread them methodically, one at a time, reading the numbers, the dates, the notes that Marcus had casually dismissed as inconsequential. It was quiet, deliberately quiet. No one else was in the house. Even the faint hum of the refrigerator seemed to pause, leaving only the rustle of paper and my own breathing. I traced a line with my finger along the margin of a statement, the $3.5 million transfer, seeing how easily it had moved, how carefully it had been logged, yet leaving subtle traces that only someone paying attention would notice. I thought of my father. Always measured, always cautious, yet passive. His idea of family security had always been a mixture of appearances and unspoken rules. Keep the accounts balanced, make sure everyone behaved, but never intervene unless a disaster was visible to all. That had taught me more than I realized. I knew the value of patience, the weight of silence. I knew that things moved in predictable ways if left to systems rather than emotions. Marcus, with all his charm and arrogance, had overlooked the one constant in our family's quiet mechanisms: observation. Documents, phone records, schedules. He assumed compliance equaled ignorance. He assumed I would react emotionally, that I would argue or cry or confront. He didn't realize I was cataloging everything, every small piece of evidence, every pattern of his entitlement, like a silent historian. I leaned back in my chair, eyes narrowing slightly as I considered the options. Not that Marcus would know. He believed the only choice was what he presented, him in control, me as observer. But in my mind, the choice had already taken shape, the contours of it tracing themselves across every spreadsheet, every clause, every note Samuel had highlighted. I did not need to name it, not yet. Naming it would be premature. Naming it would reveal a strategy far too early. The key wasn't reaction. The key was timing. The key was letting the system, the documents, the facts, and Marcus's own overconfidence do the work for me. Every move I considered in that quiet room was deliberate. Every pause, every unread line, every annotation in pencil on a margin, was part of a structure I was building silently. I remembered small lessons from my father's values. Power is measured by restraint, influence is proven by control, and patience always outlives arrogance. I allowed myself a small, satisfied thought. Not satisfaction at revenge, but a calm recognition of inevitability. The pieces were aligning. The plan, unnamed and invisible to anyone but me, was nearly complete. I flipped through a legal statement from Samuel, noting a procedural window that Marcus had entirely ignored. He thought oversight worked in his favor, but I had been watching schedules, delivery notices, certified letters, all quietly noting which deadlines could be leveraged. His certainty was a vulnerability I could exploit with a precision that required no confrontation, no raised voice, no dramatic gestures. By the time I stacked the papers neatly, the sun had shifted further across the floor, light touching the polished edges of the desk. I allowed myself a single, deep breath, a small acknowledgement of control. I reached for my calendar and, with deliberate calm, scheduled a single meeting. Not a confrontation, not a warning, not an announcement, just a quiet, procedural step that would ensure the next stage of the plan moved forward according to the structure I had already built in my mind. As I clicked confirm, I felt a subtle weight lift. Everything was still hidden, everything still quiet. But the momentum had shifted. Marcus's confidence, so carefully nurtured, was about to encounter consequences he could not predict. And I, quietly seated in the corner of that sunlit room, was the only one who knew it. The morning light fell flat across the polished conference table, highlighting the neat stacks of documents Samuel had arranged with the precision of someone who understood that every line carried weight. Richard sat opposite me, quiet, eyes scanning the same papers I had spent hours memorizing in my home office. The room smelled faintly of coffee and the faint antiseptic scent of the law firm. It was calm, procedural, utterly controlled. No one spoke Marcus's name. He was absent by choice, convinced that absence would prevent interference. He underestimated the mechanisms at work. I did not correct him, did not hint at the vigilance I had maintained. I simply observed, letting the silence stretch between us like a measured pause in a symphony. Richard began reading aloud from the first document, his voice even, professional. Each word, each clause, was deliberate, the transfer conditions, the trustee authorizations, the bank confirmations. He didn't raise alarms, he didn't dramatize. He merely stated facts, and the weight of those facts rested heavily on the table. Samuel's finger occasionally traced a line, confirming signatures, verifying dates, ensuring that nothing was ambiguous. I followed every motion with calm attention. Every stamp, every initial, every numbered section was already familiar, but seeing it executed in person had a gravity that reading alone could not convey. It was the quiet authority of law asserting itself, immutable, procedural, precise. The power was not in loud words, in threats, or in confrontation. The power was in the certainty of documentation, in the inevitability that processes move whether you scream at them or not. Richard paused at one clause, pointing subtly to a margin note Samuel had added. The language was terse, cold, but functional. It indicated a limit, a window, a condition that Marcus had ignored entirely. I did not react outwardly. Internally, I allowed a small acknowledgement. This was the hinge of what I had been constructing in my mind all these weeks. The shift from potential to action. Samuel passed me a copy of the final paperwork for my review. I scanned each line once, methodically, without emotion, my eyes absorbing every detail. There was a rhythm to it, almost mechanical, yet utterly human. Each clause was enforceable, each signature binding, each procedural step irreversible once filed. I felt a subtle tightening in my chest, not fear, not excitement, just the acknowledgement that what was about to occur could not be altered through argument or charm. I thought of Marcus briefly, picturing his confident smirk, his assumption that absence meant immunity. I let the thought pass, observing the gap between perception and reality. He had no idea that the system, which he had taken lightly, was now executing without him. He could not intervene. He could not undo what was set into motion. The papers were signed, the initials in place, the notarized statements in Samuel's meticulous care. Richard reviewed the stack one final time, confirming dates, verifying procedures, ensuring the chain of custody was unbroken. The ritual was clinical, precise. There was no fanfare, no celebration, no acknowledgement beyond the professional nods that passed between attorney and trustee. I closed my eyes briefly and allowed a calm thought to settle in my mind. This was the moment where everything shifted, though no one in the room would realize it yet. The quiet, procedural, legal mechanisms were now in play. Marcus's assumptions, his confidence, his control, irrelevant. The law moved forward regardless of his presence or absence. As Samuel gathered the files and prepared them for submission, Richard offered a neutral observation, almost casually. Once filed, it could not be undone. I did not respond aloud. I did not need to. I simply noted it, internalized it. The phrase carried the weight of inevitability, the finality of procedure. Outside the walls of the firm, the world remained unaware, oblivious to the quiet reordering of authority and consequence. Inside, the system was alive, deliberate, and unstoppable. I stood slowly, returning each signed document to its precise position in the folder. The weight was physical, but it was also symbolic. Marcus's overconfidence would meet the cold reality of fact, and I would not be the one delivering the blow. The law, the documents, the procedure, it would do that silently, methodically, and irrevocably. Walking out of the office, I felt the calm certainty that the next steps were no longer mine to act upon in a dramatic sense. Time, the system, and careful observation had become my allies. Marcus's absence, which he had thought protective, only reinforced the inevitability of what had been set into motion. And as I slid into the car, briefcase resting lightly on the passenger seat, I realized that this quiet, procedural victory would ripple outward slowly. I did not need to speak, to confront, to gloat. The mechanism was in place, and all I needed was patience. Time would be the instrument now, carrying forward consequences that could not be interrupted. The legal system, once set in motion, would unfold precisely as it was designed. Marcus's certainty would crack, not with noise, not with drama, but with the quiet weight of reality itself. And I, seated calmly behind the wheel, understood that this patience was no longer passive. It was the form of power I had been waiting to wield. I watched Marcus pacing across the marble floors of the living room, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, jaw clenched in the way he did when his confidence wavered, but he refused to show it. He had just returned from an unproductive call with Samuel, the trustee, and his usual charm was stripped down to an edge of frustration he clearly did not know how to mask. "You don't get it, do you?" he said finally, not looking at me, voice low and controlled, almost testing me. This, whatever this is, it's temporary. You'll fix it. You always fix things. I was sitting in the armchair near the window, the sunlight cutting across the polished woodside table. My hands rested lightly on my lap. Calm. Observant. I allowed him the space to feel he was in control, even as the subtle shifts in his posture betrayed that he already wasn't. You should speak up, he continued, turning finally to face me. His eyes searched for some hint, some recognition, some sign that the fear or guilt I must be feeling would prompt me to rescue him. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you're going to, make this all okay. That's what you always do, right? I inclined my head slightly, a faint smile that was not meant to mock, merely to acknowledge his persistence. It was almost gentle, though my mind was analyzing every nuance of his behavior, every pause between words. I could see the illusion of authority he clung to, the invisible cracks in his confidence forming like slow fractures in a marble floor. You're calm, he said finally, voice tight, confused. I thought, he hesitated. I thought you'd be panicked. You'd be yelling. His hands gripped the back of a chair, white-knuckled. You'd be doing something. I did nothing. Not a gesture, not a word beyond the faint acknowledgement of his presence. Silence had become my instrument, my shield, my strategy. I was neither hostile nor forgiving. I was simply observing, letting the consequences unfold without interference. He shifted, stepping closer, lowering his voice. Evelyn, please. I need to know that. His eyes searched mine, desperate for confirmation, for reassurance that I was still somehow within his grasp, that the world had not yet acknowledged the subtle collapse he had ignored. I maintained eye contact, controlled, unflinching. My posture relaxed, almost casual, yet every line of my body was precise, deliberate. There was no panic, no appeal, no manipulation. I offered nothing but the calm certainty that the rules were no longer his to shape. Marcus's hands fell slowly to his sides. He realized, even if only subconsciously, that the power balance had shifted, though he could not yet name the source. He could not yet grasp the mechanism, the quiet instruments of authority I had set in motion. The trustee, the documents, the legal precision he had assumed he could sidestep. I just need to know, he began again, faltering, as if the act of speaking could claw back some lost control. Tell me it's going to be okay. Tell me something. I let the room fill with quiet. I did not speak. I did not nod. I did not promise. My silence was not cruelty, it was precision. It was the slow, steady assertion of the reality he had ignored, the one he would not fully recognize until the mechanisms I had set in motion were fully visible. He took a step back, shoulders tight, chest rising and falling with a shallow rhythm of tension. The realization that he could not command the situation, that he had already lost the narrative, hovered in the space between us. Yet he still searched for a lifeline, some acknowledgement from me that could undo the logic of the documents, the trustee's authority, the calculated delay that had stripped him of control. And I did nothing. Not a single word. Not a single movement beyond the calm positioning of my hands. My restraint, my composure, my silent observation were all he could face. The room itself seemed to reinforce the inevitability of what was unfolding, the quiet power of procedure and patience that he had never anticipated. Finally, he let out a barely audible sigh. Evelyn, please, tell me I haven't ruined everything. His eyes searched mine, seeking reassurance that the foundations he had taken for granted were still somehow intact. I remained still. My silence answered more than words ever could. It left him with the weight of uncertainty, the understanding that the structures he relied upon were no longer controlled by him. That subtle, legal, and procedural shifts, the ones he had overlooked, were now acting quietly, steadily, and irrevocably. The quiet hung between us. And as Marcus stood there, unsure, tense, waiting for confirmation that would not come, I felt the first genuine sense that the power he wielded so casually had begun to slip away entirely. And in that silence, I allowed myself a single, private acknowledgement. Time and patience were now my allies. The shift was complete, though he could not yet see it. My quiet refusal to answer him set the stage for what was next. The consequences were coming, and he would face them without my guidance, without my intervention, and without escape. The morning was unusually quiet. Sunlight fell across the polished oak table in the conference room, glinting off the papers Samuel had arranged with meticulous precision. I sat at one end, hands folded lightly on the surface, reading nothing but the room itself. Marcus occupied the seat opposite me, Lena beside him, and Samuel and Richard flanking us like the silent arbiters of some inevitable judgment. Samuel began without ceremony, his voice neutral, precise. "We are here to finalize the adjustments to the trust fund allocations. The following readings reflect actions already authorized under the clauses previously discussed." He moved through the numbers deliberately, almost mechanically. I didn't flinch. I didn't lean forward. I simply listened, aware of how every word landed in the room. Lena shifted slightly next to Marcus, her hand brushing his, but her expression was unreadable. An imperceptible recognition that the structure she assumed was unshakable had been altered quietly and irrevocably. Marcus' foot tapped once, then twice. His confidence wavered ever so slightly with each figure Samuel read aloud. The magnitude of what had been executed without fanfare, the withdrawal, the allocation, the final confirmations, was sinking in. His lips pressed together. He looked at me, searching for a reaction, for a flicker of panic that never came. Richard spoke briefly, his tone calm, almost neutral. "All documents have been verified. Signatures, verifications, and trustee confirmations are complete. The allocations are in effect as of the date listed." Marcus' eyes darted between Samuel, Richard, Lena, and then me. He knew the language, knew the clauses, yet he could not parse the silent mechanisms that had guided them into motion. His wife's face remained still, unreadable, but the tension in her shoulders was the first outward sign that even she recognized the magnitude of the shift. Samuel continued, his calm voice outlining minor procedural notes, the type that sounded innocuous to anyone untrained in financial governance but that in reality closed loopholes Marcus had assumed were open. "Any amendments must be processed in accordance with the existing trustee powers and statutory requirements. No retroactive changes may be applied without unanimous consent, which has not been sought." Marcus swallowed, the sound barely audible over the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Lena's gaze flicked briefly toward him, sharp, steady, as if measuring the gravity of what was occurring. I allowed myself a small inhale, steady, even, watching him unravel line by line. There were no dramatic gestures, no shouted accusations. The weight of the facts, the irrevocable documentation, the procedural authority, the legal closure, settled around him like a physical presence. Each line Samuel read was another brick in the wall Marcus had believed he could ignore, another thread in the web he thought he could manipulate. I saw the subtle shift in Lena first, a slight exhale, a nod to herself that this had been done correctly, decisively. Marcus was slower, his mind racing but tethered to the inescapable reality of the paperwork, the procedural confirmations, the silent authority of Samuel and Richard. He looked at me, pleading silently for some mistake, some chance to reclaim what had already been lost. I offered nothing. My posture remained calm, my face neutral, my mind cataloguing the responses, the small twitches, the tiny betrayals of composure. Time and procedure had already done what no argument or confrontation could. Marcus' belief in his untouchability had been dismantled quietly, irreversibly. As the last line was read and Samuel closed the binder with the faintest click, the air in the room felt different. He had been confident, assured, and charming moments ago. Now he sat smaller, slouched slightly, as if the ceilings themselves had lowered, the walls closing in not physically, but psychologically. The room held its quiet, controlled tension. Lena sat straighter, eyes trained on the table, aware of the shift but careful not to gloat. I remained still, absorbing the procedural reality of what had just occurred, my calm a deliberate counterpoint to the slow unraveling of my brother's certainty. Marcus finally exhaled, a long, low release of tension that did not relieve him but acknowledged the weight he could not deny. He glanced at Samuel and Richard, then back at me, searching for an answer, a flaw, a crack, but found nothing. The silence was complete, absolute, and unyielding. And in that silence, I noted the quiet fact: power had shifted without spectacle, without drama, and without warning. Marcus had not lost because of confrontation, he had lost because the mechanisms were no longer his to command. As the meeting concluded, the documents returned to Samuel's briefcase, and the room emptied slowly, the sense of contraction lingered. The space felt smaller, tighter, as if the very air had been rearranged by the weight of irrevocable actions. And in that compressed atmosphere, I understood, fully, that what was coming next would not be negotiable, and that my patience had become a force he could no longer resist. The days after the final filings were quieter than I expected. No shouting, no frantic phone calls. Instead, There was a subtle, almost imperceptible disintegration happening around Marcus, a slow burn that could only be measured in the small cracks left in his world. I observed it with the same quiet restraint I had brought to every step before. Marcus tried to speak at first, sitting across from me at the dining table, his coffee untouched, fingers drumming against the porcelain. His charm, once effortless, was frayed, every syllable carrying a desperation he did not understand. "Evelyn, he began, then paused, realizing the words had no purchase. I met his eyes calmly, expression neutral, waiting, allowing the silence to emphasize the futility of his appeal. His business contacts had started asking questions he could not answer. Banks, once pliable under his name, were now slow, cautious, unwilling to move without the verified documentation Samuel and Richard had finalized. The trust fund actions had not been loud, but they were legally irreversible. His access had shifted out of reach, and the $3.5 million Monaco withdrawal, a line item he had considered negligible, had cemented his exposure. He glanced at me again, more insistently this time. "Evelyn, surely you see that," his voice faltered. There was no threat in it, no bravado, only the echo of disbelief. Every attempt at argument dissolved into procedural walls I had helped set in motion quietly, without announcing their presence. I did not offer consolation. I did not shift my posture or give away any sense of triumph. There was no reason to. His discomfort was self-evident, a product of his own overconfidence. His wife, Lena, had already begun adjusting her social stance subtly, prioritizing the perception of stability now that Marcus' reliability had been publicly undercut. No confrontation, no anger, only cold observation and the unfolding reality. He leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose, trying to reconstruct the map of his privileges. Yet each line he traced led only to more questions, more walls erected by silent procedures. Credit agencies had flagged unusual withdrawals. Trustees were confirming all transactions meticulously. Access to accounts, investments, and legal permissions had shifted in a pattern he could not yet name but felt profoundly. "What did I miss?" he asked finally, the words almost a whisper, more to himself than to me. His tone carried the weight of disbelief, the faint tremor of someone realizing that control was no longer theirs. I continued to watch him, the quietest acknowledgement that the rules of the game had been rewritten. His public image began to fracture. Invitations that once came automatically were now met with hesitation. Professional respect, which he had assumed was a birthright, was now conditional, tentative, eroding at the edges. He did not shout, did not cry, did not curse. He simply sat in the empty space between the knowledge of his loss and the inability to reclaim it. I remembered the paperwork, the careful clauses, the trustee notes, and the quiet hours spent reviewing each signature, each verification. Nothing had been impulsive. Every line, every procedural checkpoint had been anticipated. My calm had become the vehicle for the outcome, and the slow unraveling of his privileges was its proof. He leaned forward again, trying a different approach, softer, more pleading. "Evelyn, tell me what happened? Just explain." But even the words had no authority. The truth was built on paper, on verification, on law. It did not require explanation, only recognition. I allowed the silence to fill the room, letting the weight of the procedural certainty press against him. His attempts at charm, at negotiation, at leveraging our shared family history, were now irrelevant. The mechanics of consequence were no longer in his hands. He was present, but powerless. By the time he stopped trying, the room had shifted. The quiet gravity of reality had replaced the comfortable chaos of entitlement. Marcus' reputation, finances, and access had all begun to crack, and there was no repair that could come from words alone. He had no one to blame, no one to bargain with, and no procedural loophole left unexplored. I remained seated, composed, neutral. There was no gloating, no triumph, only the understanding that patience, precision, and silent procedure had delivered what no argument or confrontation could. Time, law, and careful observation had executed the outcome quietly, leaving him exposed without spectacle. As he finally stood, drained and muttering half-formed questions under his breath, I let my eyes meet his just once. No smile, no taunt, just steady acknowledgement. The consequence was done. The next steps would be for him to reconcile with reality on his own terms, a reality I would not participate in shaping any further. The day ended with the same quiet regularity it had begun. I moved through it calmly, aware that the silent, procedural victory had already established boundaries he could no longer cross. Marcus had failed to see the invisible hand guiding his collapse, and that oversight would define his life going forward. I did not speak. I did not intervene. I only existed, steady, as the world quietly adjusted around the choices he had made, and the one he had never anticipated. Time passed with a rhythm that felt almost imperceptible at first. The sharp edge of the Monaco withdrawal, the tense meetings with Richard and Samuel, the quiet unraveling of Marcus' privileges, all of it became part of the background, like furniture you stop noticing but cannot remove. I moved through my days deliberately, aware that the quiet stability I now inhabited had been hard-earned and procedural, not dramatic or theatrical. Mornings began with coffee at the kitchen table, the sunlight filtering through blinds, illuminating the neat stack of financial statements I had left untouched until I was ready. Each envelope, each certified letter, each trustee note I had meticulously reviewed months ago now served as quiet reminders of why actions on paper could carry weight far beyond what words alone could accomplish. No one needed to announce it. Documents and signatures, carefully placed, had already spoken. The world outside continued, largely unaware of the slow legal collapse Marcus endured. Social invitations that once fell effortlessly into his lap no longer appeared, and contacts he had taken for granted became cautious, asking questions that he could not answer. Lena adjusted her social tone, not from spite but necessity, reflecting the subtle shift in her husband's position. I observed from a distance, my attention measured, not smug, knowing that my restraint had made the difference. At home, there was a new cadence. Meals were quiet but pleasant, filled with the ordinary textures of life. The hiss of coffee brewing, the faint aroma of toasted bread, the casual hum of conversation that did not carry threat or entitlement. I did not announce my relief, nor did I allow the absence of conflict to feel like victory. It was merely the natural consequence of the choices I had set in motion. Time, law, and patience had orchestrated the outcome silently. I often reflected on the mechanics behind it, not out of pride but to remain vigilant. The trust fund's structure, the clauses I had studied and followed without deviation, the careful use of certified correspondence, all were tools that ensured the process was unassailable. Silence had been my ally, and precision my instrument. Those who underestimate the weight of documents, or the enforceable quiet of legal systems, are rarely prepared when the consequences arrive without ceremony. Financial calls came less frequently, and Marcus' attempts to regain access were met with procedural deflections that required no explanation from me. Samuel and Richard continued their oversight, reliable and neutral, ensuring that every motion adhered to the law. The system I had leaned on had not faltered, and I no longer needed to intervene actively. I only existed within the framework I had carefully navigated, allowing the process itself to maintain its integrity. Evenings brought their own calm. I walked through the neighborhood, noticing the mundane rhythms of life, mail being collected, neighbors conversing softly across driveways, children riding bicycles along familiar sidewalks. Each scene reinforced the contrast between ordinary continuity and the quiet, irreversible impact of deliberate, paper-bound actions. There was no fanfare in consequences, no spectacle, only the steady unfolding of reality. I considered Marcus rarely, and when I did, it was with detached clarity. He had been given every opportunity to understand, to respond, to correct, yet his choices, arrogance, and assumptions had led him to this point. I did not gloat. I did not speak. His undoing was complete because the framework of law, the certainty of procedure, and the patient application of quiet action had left no room for reclamation. Sometimes, when the day ended and the house was still, I allowed myself a moment to acknowledge the weight of what had occurred. Not triumph, not vengeance, simply comprehension. Every document, every signature, every silent observation had mattered. The world had shifted gently but irreversibly, and I had been present to ensure that it did. I kept to my routine, attentive to details that others might miss. The texture of paper, the timing of correspondence, the precise ordering of records. Each minor act reinforced that procedural diligence, paired with patience and restraint, is often far more effective than confrontation. Those who dismiss these quiet tools rarely realize their power until it is too late. The house felt lighter now, the tension absent. Even my parents carried themselves differently, an unspoken acknowledgement of boundaries long established and quietly enforced. Marcus existed within the new parameters, often unaware of how fully the framework had closed around him. I never reminded him. There was no need. And as I sat in the evening light, tracing the faint lines of documents I had signed, I understood the clarity of distance, the permanence of careful decisions, and the quiet authority that comes from knowing one's own steadiness is unassailable. There would be no speeches, no closure rituals, no dramatic vindication. The work had been done. I let the silence stretch, allowing the gravity of it to settle. The past, the trust fund, the stolen $3.5 million, all were memories housed in paper and procedure. I moved forward, measured, composed, fully aware that some victories need no announcement, that some boundaries need no defense beyond their own quiet certainty. And in that stillness, I realized the truth. Control was not taken. It had always been quietly claimed, one deliberate step at a time, written, signed, and left to unfold without interference. The world adjusted, and I remained, calm, composed, and irrevocably unshaken. Some lessons, I thought, are learned not in noise or anger, but in the deliberate stillness of documents left perfectly in order, and the quiet understanding that what is legally and procedurally established cannot be undone. I poured my coffee, placed the papers back in their folder, and finally allowed myself to exhale. Life continued, measured, irreversible, and mine alone to inhabit. The papers rested silently. So did I.